Hey everybody, welcome to this Google Hangout. Hope everybody's doing well. Just loading up the Q&A. Great. So my apologies for this ending up during the World Cup match going on at the moment. But anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a couple of points related to the article that this Hangout is supposed to be about, which is the article on the site called Your Core Muscles Deeper Than You Think. And I want to kind of maybe clear up a couple of things or elaborate on a couple of those things, and then we'll move on to the Q&A part. In that regard, I'll cover any questions directly related to the article first, and then if you have any other questions while I'm talking or bringing up some other points, go ahead and type them in on the Q&A app. If you're not sure where that is, if you hover your mouse over the screen, you should see a little, some little boxes down the left-hand side, and there's one that says Q&A. Click that, and that's where the questions are that I'll be answering. So let's go ahead and get started. Let me dive into a couple of things. First is, the point I was trying to make with this article is that the core muscles go deeper than we think. And what I mean by that is we have a tendency to think about core muscles, and then that's kind of where it ends. We think about the psoas and all of the muscles that I listed in the article. But in reality, the core is on a continuum. It's not just about muscles. So in other words, depending on the perspective that we're using, we're kind of looking at the muscles at one end of the spectrum of being sort of the gross level, and then as we move into the more subtle levels, we start talking about energy, or that's where we start to get into the bandha conversation as it relates to it. And there's a couple of comments on the article itself, and one of them was brought up by Nathan. And he kind of gets to the exact reason why I was writing this. And to be fair, maybe I could have articulated it a little bit better. But it goes to this idea of complexity of gross to subtle and how these things are all sort of mixed together and get interrelated with one another. As it turns out, he commented on a couple of the related articles that were tagged in this post. That I wrote a couple years ago, how Mula Bandha anatomically speaking, and Uddiyana Bandha, and how breath leads to Bandha, and all that kind of stuff. And we have a tendency to segment things so that we can talk about them, but if we forget to tie them together, then we kind of lose that whole perspective on what's going on with our practice or with the body. And I see this all the time when I teach anatomy workshops, where I have to sort of teach the parts and pieces and somehow find some way to integrate these things and these concepts, or they be specifically some anatomical parts. So let's try to integrate this a little bit further. In terms of the muscles, well, everybody's pretty familiar with what's going on in the body in terms of, the abdominal muscles, the iliopsoas, the pelvic floor, all of that kind of stuff. And in relationship to the article, that's all about, the stability created by the core muscles. And it also ties into movement, and this is where it starts to overlap with bandhas, because we see the effect of the bandhas in our movement. And so I've done in the workshops, I often bring out my spine and my leg and talk about the psoas and its relationship to movement and how it slows us down as we jump back or float forward, and all of that is good and important. But we have to take it a step further as we dive into that more sort of subtle realm of things, and that's how we get to bandhas. And so the physical is definitely a sort of manifestation of the bandhas, Or if we want to go, maybe we don't say bandhas, maybe we say energetic. Because that's the other end of the continuum. The energetic supports the physical. The bandhas are the mechanism for controlling that energetic system. And so here we go. We're starting to, sort of create a soup. There's the identification with very specific muscles for the bandhas. So in terms of Mula Bandha, everybody associates it with the pelvic floor. That's not untrue, but that's not really it exactly either. And one of the points I make here is that, the bandhas themselves are energetic, they're not muscular. We kind of have to separate those two things, at least theoretically. Do they have a relationship? Of course they do. So we focus on Mula Bandha or engage Mula Bandha to stimulate, we engage the pelvic floor to stimulate Mula Bandha, but that doesn't make the pelvic floor itself Mula Bandha. Just like, we normally associate drawing the abdomen in, which is usually transverse abdominis, which would be doing that. And although there's a relationship between the transverse abdominis and Uddiyana Bandha, the transverse abdominis itself is not Uddiyana Bandha, but they have the relationship. So this is where the confusion in my mind starts to set in, is we overly focus on that physical aspect, looking for a bandha, and hopefully it does lead us there at some point, but then once we get there, we realize that it wasn't the muscle all along anyway. That was just what transported us to an understanding of what the bandha actually was. So it's not like we shouldn't think about the musculature, or we shouldn't think about the physical movements that get us there. We should, but that's not necessarily the end of the story. And then if you peel that layer away, well, what is the energetic system anyway? It's really about consciousness. And so another way of, I guess, describing all of this is, depending on the perspective of mind we take, we see the bandhas or the energy manifesting in different ways. So if we're at the gross level of mind, we're seeing the physicality. We're seeing the muscles. We're experiencing the muscles. If we're going into more subtle layers of mind, then maybe we're seeing the energetics, or feeling the energetics, or experiencing the energetics. And if we go even further, we're into the very subtle, if you will, which is like a very deep level of awareness. And I'm not talking about like, I'm awake now, I'm aware I'm awake now. I'm talking about deeper awareness. And at that point, all of this stuff kind of goes away, and you're left with the core of who you really are. And I mean that in the biggest sense of yoga. And I think that's what the bandhas are really about, is kind of driving us in that direction, even though we use them to manipulate the physicality and the energetics in our body. So that's where I was going with all of this. And there are a couple of questions on here already. There's some sacrum stuff. I'm gonna do Sven's question to start things off. How important is it to breathe? I'm gonna select it first. How important is it to breathe down to the hips, because the breathing can't physically go there? It's true, Sven. Your breath doesn't go down to your hips. But what does go all the way down to your hips, or let's say pelvis, is the force generated by your diaphragm moving. And so this is why, and actually Nathan, who did the comment on the article itself, kind of pointed this out, that there is this relationship between breathing and bandha, which I said as well, but he said you can feel it at the end of the exhalation. That was the part specifically. So when we inhale, the diaphragm drops down and presses the abdominal contents towards the pelvic floor, as well as out through the abdomen if we don't have the abdomen drawn in. If we have the abdomen drawn in, well, this is something very different, and then that force can't go out through the abdomen, so it's putting a pressure onto the pelvic floor, which we may also then be resisting by engaging the pelvic floor muscles, as we do for Mula Bandha, for instance. So in that sense, the breath itself doesn't go down to the hips. However, the force generated by breathing does go down to the hips and the pelvic floor. All right. Uh, what is the cause? What are the causes of pain in the tailbone after abdominal exercises? Good question. I'd have to be throwing a guess out at this point. There might be something else going on, but what comes to mind initially is that the abdominal muscles end at the pubic bone, and from that point, they essentially become the pelvic floor muscles. And of course, the pelvic floor muscles brings up perineum and pubococcygeal muscles, which is all related to mula bandha, or often gets tied together with mula bandha. So it's possible that through the abdominal exercises, you're changing or shifting the tension in the pelvic floor as well. Could be direct, could be an engagement of those pelvic floor muscles, could be indirect and isolated to the abdominal contraction, but chances are they get mixed together. And so maybe there's a change in tension there. That sounds plausible to me. I don't know. You might have to test out that theory somehow. You might do some pelvic floor exercises without trying to overly contract your abdominal muscles and see if that brings about the same issue. We've got an injury, L5S1 joint facet for the last 8 months. Ashtanga practitioner pulling off of second series. Deep back bending is a challenge. When you say lots of mula bandha, you have to be careful with that because too much gross contraction could end up being part of the problem. I'm not saying that it is, I don't know, but it's possible. L5S1 joint facet, that's getting into SI issues. I would look. There's a great article on yoganatomy.com, gluteal psoas relationship. That might lead to a couple of insights. There's usually some relationship with, since you are a second series practitioner, deep back bending and maybe the leg behind head stuff. I don't know if that comes up for you or not in those areas. But maybe there's an imbalance between, let's say, psoas in the front, gluteals in the back, something along those lines. That's creating some type of imbalance. You didn't mention whether it was right-sided, left-sided, or equal to both, so I'm not really sure. If it's one-sided, then my guess would be it would be your tighter side in some form or fashion. So you might need to release some tissues on that side before diving into some of the deeper back bendings and or leg behind head. Hopefully I made a good guess there for you. Looks like there's one more question here. Pain around the sacrum for years. Yoga's helped a lot. I'm now working on asanas that open my hips, but after doing these I feel pulsating pain in sacrum at Warrior 1. Well, let's assume that there's a relationship between those two, although lots of asanas to open your hips is a little bit vague. We would probably want to know whether you're opening the front of your hips, the side of your hips, or in a rotational way, and that could be externally or internally. It could be adductors, so it's not quite specific. What I would say is do a test, back off of those asanas that open your hips, and see if the Warrior 1 pain goes away. If it does, then you know it's something you're doing there, assuming that you have a set sequence for that. Then start sort of pulling out some of those asanas that you're doing to open your hips. And just all you can do is really test for it. You didn't list what they were, so it's hard for me to get a handle on which one of those it could be. Right on. Any other questions? Go ahead and type it in. Last few minutes, otherwise we'll end the Hangout and get back to the World Cup game. All right, I don't see anything coming in, so thanks a lot for joining me, and we're going to try to do the Hangouts every couple of months, and maybe we leave them as a more open Q&A, maybe we do them based on a particular article. We'll see how it goes. If you haven't been by the website in a while, although I'll guess most of you viewing this have been, make sure you're signed up to find out about the release of the Yoga Anatomy book that I've written. It should be out by the end of August. I'm really excited about that, so hope you'll go by the website, sign up, and see you somewhere in the world soon. Take care.